Hello, and welcome to another live whisky-me tasting, if you are watching this live, which leads me on to a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. We are now broadcasting live through 3 different social media networks, that being Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. So you can now take your pick as to which one you prefer. We're not doing TikTok or Snapchat just yet. If you want my opinion, you should be viewing this through Facebook or through YouTube if you can, just because it's a higher quality broadcast. Also means it's much easier for us to see your comments. And if you are watching this through Instagram, then don't worry too much. You can always go back and watch the videos on Facebook or on YouTube afterwards, because they'll be staying up there permanently. And hello to anyone who is not watching this live. I hope the future is looking better than the present. So we are going to be doing our usual tasting of this month's drop. Just to make sure you've got everything you need before we get started, you're going to need a glass. Doesn't have to be like that, but these ones work pretty well. You're going to need your pouch of whiskey, obviously. I know some people have consumed it already, so just grab another whiskey if you want. And I would recommend a little jug of water as well, because it's yet another strong one we've got this month. Not quite as strong as the Glenfarclas, but approaching that kind of strength. So this month's whiskey is Glen Scotia Victoriana. I'm going to just do that for the Instagrammers and then for the Facebook and YouTubers. Hopefully you've got your pouch, and hopefully you've left some of it for this tasting. If you've already enjoyed it, then that's fine. This is still a good place to perhaps grab a few bits of trivia information about the whiskey, or to have a look at the comments, which I'm going to get up now actually, just to see if anyone's got any opinions on it that you find interesting, that you agree or disagree with. We're trying to make this better every single month. And you're going to see new kind of features appearing on these live broadcasts as we get better at it. And regardless of lockdowns and that sort of thing, we're going to continue doing this indefinitely, because we seem to be getting pretty good feedback around it so far. So yeah, Glen Scotia. Now, this is an interesting distillery because it's located in the historic whiskey producing region of Campbelltown. Now, Campbelltown is, of course, a town, population about 5,000, but it's also one of the regions of Scotch whiskey, that being Speyside, Lowlands, Highlands, Islands, and Campbelltown. But this particular region has only got 3 distilleries in it. And if we went back 20 years ago, it would only have 2, Glen Scotia being one of them. But Campbelltown has a massive historical significance to the Scotch whisky industry. In fact, this little town was once known as the whisky capital of the world. And during the Victorian period, which, by the way, we're going to talk to a little bit more about, because this is called Victoriana, Campbelltown had somewhere between 20 and 30 different working distilleries, depending on which year you're in exactly. And I've actually got a little image to show you here. This was, if you're on Instagram, you won't be able to see that, but you can always go back and look at it on YouTube or Facebook. We've just popped up an image there, an old illustration of Campbelltown from 1890, which shows 9 distilleries just in that one vista. And at the time, they're around about 21, I think. So it was a massive workhorse of the whiskey industry. And producing, in the early Victorian era at least, some pretty good stuff. But as time went on, it started being a case of producing volume over quality. And this came back to bite Campbelltown in the arse a little bit, especially when it got to the 1920s, where a few different things happened that caused nearly every distillery in the town to close down. One of those was Prohibition in America, which meant there was a lot less demand for whiskey from Europe, from Scotland, and therefore a lot of producers had overproduced, and just the economics didn't work anymore. But also blenders were looking for lighter styles of whiskies, and Campbelltown is historically recognized for producing robust, oily, quite peaty, dense, meaty whiskies. Whiskies of great character, actually. So the kind of liquids that Campbeltown was producing even when Prohibition ended, going into the 1930s and 1940s, were just too much for most people. Blenders were looking for these lighter styles of malts. And so what you're left with from about 1934 onwards was only 2 distilleries in the town, that being Springbank and Glen Scotia. And Glen Scotia remains today one of the smallest distilleries in Scotland. That's a picture of Campbeltown for those watching on Facebook and YouTube. Picture of Campbeltown just popped up now. That's what it looks like today. No distilleries visible in that particular picture, but both Glen Scotia and Springbank are sort of tucked away down that back streets. So yeah, from 1934 onwards, only 2 distilleries in the entire town, but they have sort of continued carrying the torch for Campbeltown style whiskey. It's thought by many that one of the reasons why those 2 distilleries survived is that they produced a lighter style of spirit compared to the other distilleries of their era, of the Victorian era. But the whiskies that come out of Glen Scotia and out of Springbank are still quite notable for their oiliness and their richness. So that tells us a little bit about what the kind of spirit produced in Campbeltown during the Victorian era must have been like. And that really was the purpose of Victoriana. The guys at Glen Scotia were looking to produce a spirit that was sort of reminiscent of that golden era of Campbeltown whiskey, something that harked back to that day when Campbeltown was an industrial powerhouse of whiskey production. It was also, by the way, a very popular holiday spot. If you were living in Glasgow, they'd had steamships going in and out of the harbour there in Campbeltown, and it was, a place that you wanted to be seen. A lot of people had second homes there. It was a big fishing industry at the time as well. So yes, Glen Scotia Victoriana is trying to speak of that particular period in its liquid. So let's crack this. I haven't cracked mine yet. I'm going to do it right now. By the way, if you have any questions, then do fire them up, and I will try my best to answer them. So pour this out. I'm just going to pour out half a glass for now. So as I mentioned, Glen Scotia is one of the smallest distilleries in Scotland. They only have a pair of stills producing spirits, whereas some distilleries have an upwards of 20 stills. That gives you some idea of the size of the place. And this particular whiskey doesn't have an age statement, so we don't know how old the liquid in the bottle is. But we do know a few things about the production of the whiskey, things that the distiller and blender at Campbeltown have done in order to manipulate this liquid to taste something like the whiskies of the Victorian era. And most of this has been done using barrels. So specifically heavily charred American oak barrels that have previously been used in the bourbon industry, and ex-Pedro Jimenez barrels, which were previously used to hold Pedro Jimenez sherry. Now, we think about the Victorian era, a lot of the casks that were being used in the whiskey industry all over Scotland at that time were actually coming from the sherry industry, not so much the bourbon industry. So that Pedro Jimenez cask is really important. But also that heavy char on the bourbon cask is really important as well, because it's going to give us some of that sooty, ashy, dark quality that would have been quite prototypical of Campbeltown whiskies during that particular period. So let's get in there. I've talked myself into really wanting to drink this now. I hope you guys are ready for it as well. Stick a nose in there and have a sniff. Now, the first thing I noticed is it is quite bourbony on the nose. That charred cask, which, by the way, the whiskey actually starts out life in second fill bourbon cask. It's a finishing in the charred cask and the Pedro Jimenez cask. And sometimes the finishing is the component of the maturation profile that really leaves that lasting effect, because it's the last part of the maturation. So it's only about a year, I think, in these heavily charred casks. You really get that on the nose, a kind of charred bourbony. There's also creme brulee, butterscotch, It's that really oiled oak characteristic. And if you look on your label, we put an oak leaf just to signify this sort of heavy oakiness of this whiskey. It really is strong oak characteristic on the nose. Touch of smoke there. There is some peated malt used in the production of this whiskey. So you will get a little bit of smokiness come through. Glen Scotia actually use 3 different types of malt in their production: unpeated, lightly peated, and heavily peated. And this is an amalgamation of the 3, I believe. But yeah, that bourbony note's really there. A little bit of chocolate and just some light fruity notes. But there is a sort of underlying oiliness to it as well, which is one of the things that gets whiskey geeks still really excited about Campbelltown even today. So let's have a taste. And remember, before you taste, by the way, on the nose, I would not think that that was 54.2% ABV. I mean, over half the liquid in that glass is ethanol. To me, that smells sweet, oaky, chocolatey, and really rather pleasant. So, bit of a wolf in sheep's clothing, perhaps. So, tread carefully as you go in to sip it. Remember, it's strong, okay? Yes. And the wolf is revealed underneath. It's definitely got some strength to it. Ooh. But I think that strength, this is cask strength, by the way. So after that finishing in Pedro Jimenez and heavily charred bourbon casks, the liquid's just vatted together and then filled into bottles. So you're not getting any dilution from water in there, which at £65 a bottle, I think makes this a pretty good, or around about £65 a bottle, pretty good value dram, actually. So you know what I'm talking about if you've tasted it. When I say oiliness, that Campbelltown, it's like a mechanical, hard-working, greasy, sooty. It reminds me of, like, I don't know, someone loading peat into a kiln, sweating, that kind of mechanical smell of an industry, you know, in its prime in the 1890s, let's say. And then there's this sort of lashings of like wood, creamy butterscotch, all kind of meshed together. This is not what you would call a fruity whiskey. There's not a lot of fruit there on it, which is fine. I mean, this is doing what it says on the tin, Victoriana. You know, if you think about the Industrial Revolution, or the tail end of it, this is that kind of in liquid form. And there was no place for, you know, gentle floral aromatics and fruitiness in that. What we're getting here is, if there is fruit, it's dark and it's dried, probably coming from that PX. But really what we're talking about is, you know, gritty, oily, slightly smoky, and very woody whiskey. Somewhat industrial, we're getting on the comments. Someone asking, can you purchase the tasting pouches anywhere? Yeah, if you go to whisky-me, if you want to, they can buy kits on whisky-me.com under buy a bottle. Otherwise, you just need to subscribe, and we'll just send them to you until you tell us to stop, basically. Actually, going back now, I'm starting to find more sweetness on the nose. This is probably a good opportunity to add a little bit of water, actually, and see what that does to it. While we see what this whiskey does to me. It's doing something. Yep. Joe's saying big explosion of smoke followed by that sweetness. Indeed. This really does. Glasgow Shipyard. It does typify what we think of, or what like whiskey historians think of when they talk about Campbelltown as a classic mark of malt whiskey. I tell you what, the sweetness is elevated even more when you add water. And perhaps there's a little bit more fruit eking through, maybe some dried apricot, certainly still that kind of vanilla, maybe even just a touch of tropical to it as well. A little bit of dried pineapple, maybe. Someone asking, is there caramel in it? So caramel is sometimes used to color whiskey in Scotland. Now, the idea of caramel coloring is that it unifies discrepancies between color across different batches of the same whiskey, because most of us wouldn't want to go into a shop and see the same whiskey at different tones. It's caramel coloring. It's totally allowed to be used, and it should be used sort of sparingly, I suppose, really just as to create uniform color. It's my understanding that this whiskey does not contain caramel coloring to it, so it's uncolored, unchill filtered. I'll tell you what, we'll talk about chill filtering another time. I don't want to do everything on this particular tasting. Unchill filtered, uncolored, bottled at cask strength. So it's pretty much as natural as you're going to get, besides having little chips of oak floating around in it. Someone's asking about our sustainability policy in respect to returning pouches. If you're a whisky-me subscriber and you're not already aware of this, you can collect your pouches and return them to us, and we will send you a free pouch of whiskey. You need to send them back in batches of 10. And at least I think it says that. I think that's it. You check on the website anyway, because there is a whole policy there. If you send them back in smaller batches, we won't send you anything else. So just keep collecting them and sending them in batches of 10. It's going to cost you the postage for like, you know, £1 to send that back with your pouches. We will clean them and refill them and reuse them, and we will send you a pouch of whiskey to say thank you. So I'm glad some people are agreeing. The water, a bit of blueberry coming through. Certainly, it's darker fruits, if it's anything fruity coming through at all. And that really can be attributed to those Pedro Jimenez casks. Because if you've ever had Pedro Jimenez sherry, you'll know it's raisins, sultanas, dark fruits, super sweet. Okay. Yeah. And down at 40%, which that probably roughly was, you do find that there's this dryness to it. It's got a sort of bitter, dark chocolate cacao kind of thing going on the finish. Dries the palate out. Sort of reminiscent of like a good beer, the way that dries the palate out and demands that you quench your thirst by taking another sip. And that's what this whiskey wants you to do as well. And that is what I'm going to do, because who am I to say no to this delicious whiskey? So that just about wraps things up for the day. If anyone has any more questions, then fire them up quickly, because I'm going to sign off in a second. Thanks ever so much for joining. Please leave your comments in the area where you leave comments. And anything else you'd like to see from us, then by all means, you know, tell us. This is the whiskey we were tasting, by the way. Just a little bit more information there. You can buy a bottle through whisky-me.com. And I'm going to sit here talking to nobody and continue to enjoy this whiskey for a little while longer. Cheers, guys, and good night.